Hello, good morning. This is Dr. Iftikhar Ahmed Ansari, and I'm going to talk today about the parliamentary system that a modern world has in its governance method. Now, the parliamentary system that I'm going to make my presentation today, it talks about the modern democratic government. They have two forms, the parliamentary or presidential pattern of government, and the difference between the two hinges upon the principles governing the relation between the executive and legislative branch of the government. So, if the executive and legislative branches are unified and coordinated under the control of same person so that they may work in harmony, such a system is called parliamentary. And if the executive and legislative branches are largely independent of one another, but each possess check on the power of the other in order to make power limited, controlled and diffused, that system is presidential. Now here, the head of the executive is constitutionally independent of legislature in the matter of duration of his tenure and is in no way responsible for it for his political policies and actions. So parliamentary system is characterized by certain features which are unique to it and which differentiates it from its another version, that is the presidential form of government. Now, when we talk about parliamentary system, we need to talk about its nature and how it evolved and how it reached the stage where it is being considered as a separate system. In a parliamentary system, a clear distinction is made between the head of the state and the head of the government. Executive and the executive. Here, the head of the state, that is the king or queen in Britain or president in India, they possess nominal or tutelar authority, whereas the real authority rests with the government of which prime minister is the head. The king, queen or president has a de jure authority, and no doubt and legally he possesses all the powers and privileges which the constitution and laws may confer upon him. But in practice, he exercises none. He is simply the bearer of authority. Constitutional convention in Britain deprived the king or queen of all his or her power, all powers, privileges and prerogatives. In India, the authority of the president was governed by conventions inherited from Britain and deemed as a sine qua non of a parliamentary system of government. The 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act 1976 gave the convention a constitutional sanction and provided that the advice of the Council of Ministers shall be binding on the President. The 44th Amendment 1978, however, gives discretion to the President to refer the advice tendered to him on a particular matter for the reconsideration of the Cabinet if he felt hesitant to accept it in the first instance. If we look at the origin of this system, where there is a tutelar head, a nominal head and a real executive, and the difference is made how it originated, we find that the origin of parliament may be traced to two ideas, and both these ideas are of great antiquity. The first is the king, who always sought the advice of the council of the wisest and the most experienced of his subjects, and the second idea is that of representation. So, the feeling his way towards an idea of self-government, man has invented various assembly and parliament at many different periods and in many different countries, and finally the Norman kings held their courts in different parliaments of the country and summoned therein the prominent members of the church, big landlords and knights for discussion on national affairs. They were not the representatives of the people in the sense in which today we understand the word representative. So it took 8 centuries to transform that parliament into a governing body resting on the suffrage of all adult persons in the country. Now, earlier this form was very different from what it is today. The origin of Parliament can be traced to Witnagemot and the Great Council. In 1295 AD, Edward I summoned the ideal Parliament, to which attention of the king was drawn to sanction funds for public cause and before which problems of people can be placed. So the British king was not empowered to impose taxes without the approval of the Parliament, and that condition led to the prominence of importance of Parliament in subsequent years, and in 1688 the bloodless revolution, finally the Parliament gained its supremacy over the crown. But the Parliament was not democratic in character due to its limited franchise, and with the passage of time, persons of young men, they were given the right to vote, and that's how the universal enfranchisement gave legitimacy to Parliament over the king. Now, if you look at the theory of parliamentary system, we find that there are four things involved in the system of parliamentary democracy. The first is that the Parliament of elected representatives candidate, and the second is a system of parties, now each reflecting some general trend of thoughts pervading all the society, which will submit to the electorate a number of candidates for its choice and the government of the policy for which the candidates stand. So, there are four things involved in the systems of parliamentary democracy. First is the Parliament of elected representative candidates, and the second is a system of parties, each reflecting same general trend of thought pervading all the society, which will submit to the electorate a number of candidates for its choice and the program of policy for which the candidates stand. So, a system of parties is a necessary part of any system of representation. Granted an organized electorate and a system of national parties, the third characteristic is a cabinet that guides the Parliament, and yet at the same time is itself guided by the Parliament. So, the adjustment of the whole machinery of the representative system of government is very fine and delicate. The last and the most characteristic is the idea of representation. So, each of the above four concepts has to fit into the other three. Each has to play its part and be content with its part, and that's how the theory evolved of the parliamentary democracy. Now, if you look at the types of parliamentary system, presently we find the scholars of democracy such as Arend Lispa, they distinguish between these parliamentary democracies, and they say they are of two types. One is Westminster and other is consensual system. Talking about the Westminster system, it is believed that it is usually founded in the Commonwealth of Nations countries and countries which were influenced by the British policy and their political tradition. Now, these parliaments tend to have a more adversarial style of debate, and the plenary session of Parliament is more important than committees. Now, some parliaments in this model are elected using a plural voting system, that is the first past the post system. Now, such as the United Kingdom, Canada, India, Malaysia, while others use some form of proportional representation such as Ireland and New Zealand, and Australia, the House of Representatives is elected using instant runoff voting, while the Senate is elected using proportional representation through single transferable vote. Now, regardless of which system is used, the voting system tend to allow the voter to vote for a named candidate rather than a closed list. Now, most Westminster system employ strict monoism, where ministers must be members of Parliament simultaneously, while some Westminster systems such as Bangladesh, they permit the appointment of extra parliamentary ministers, and others such as Jamaica allow outsiders to be appointed to the ministry through an appointed upper house, although a majority of ministers, which by necessity include the Prime Minister, must come from within the lower house of Parliament. The second form of parliamentary system is the consensus system. Now, the Western Europe parliamentary model, especially Spain and Germany, tend to have a more consensual debating system and usually has semicircular debating chambers. So, this consensual system have a more of a tendency to use proportional representation with open party list when the Westminster model than the Westminster legislatures. The committees of this parliament tend to be more important than the plenary chamber. Most West European countries do not employ strict monoism and allow extra parliamentary ministers as a matter of course. The Netherlands, Slovakia, Sweden outright implement the principle of dualism as a form of separation of power, where members of parliament have to resign their places in parliament upon being appointed or elected minister. Now, when we look at the process of the parliamentary system whereby the appointments and elections are made, we find that the government in parliamentary system is constituted from the majority party or a combination of parties. Now, if they had agreed on certain fundamentals for purpose of coalition in legislature, the normal procedure is that the chief executive, the monarch or president summons the leader of the majority party or the coalition of parties to form the government. The person so summoned is the Prime Minister designate, who chooses his own team of ministers from among the members of his party in legislature, including a few from outside if deemed necessary and in case there is no constitutional bar to such an inclusion. The Council of Ministers thus constituted functions under the leadership of Prime Minister and is collectively responsible to the representative chamber of the legislature. Out of the Council of Ministers, the Prime Minister chooses some 15 or more, but generally not more than 20 persons who are most influential and important, and they make a cabinet. Now, implementation of parliamentary system can also differ as to how the Prime Minister and government are appointed and whether the government needs the explicit approval of the Parliament rather than just the absence of its disapproval. Some countries, such as India, also require the Prime Minister to be a member of legislature, though in other countries this only exists as a convention. Now, the head of the state appoints a Prime Minister who will likely have majority support in Parliament. Now, that is the first way of nominating or electing the head of the government. While in the majority of cases, Prime Minister in the Westminster system are the leaders of the largest party in Parliament, technically the appointment of Prime Minister is a prerogative exercised by the head of state, be it the monarch, the Governor General or the President. This system is used in Australia, Canada, Malaysia, New Zealand, United Kingdom. Now, the head of the state, second method is head of the state appoints a Prime Minister who must gain a vote of confidence within a set time. Now, this system is used in Italy and Thailand. Then the third way is that of the head of the state appoints the leader of the political party holding a plurality of seats in Parliament as Prime Minister. Now, this system is also prevalent in some of the countries, especially in Greece. If no party has a majority, the leader of the party with a plurality of seat is given an exploratory mandate to receive the confidence of the Parliament within 3 days. And if the said leader fails to obtain the confidence of Parliament, then the leader of the second largest party is given the exploratory mandate, and if that failed, then the leader of the third largest political party is given that same exploratory mandate, and so on and so forth. This system is used in Greece. Then another way of appointing the head of the government is that the head of the state nominates a candidate for prime ministership who is then submitted to Parliament for approval before final appointment. Now, example is the Spain. We find the king, he sends a proposal to the Congress of Deputies for approval. Also Germany, where under the German basic law, that is the constitution, the Bundestag votes on a candidate nominated by the federal president. Now in these cases, Parliament can choose another candidates who then would be appointed by the head of the state. Now this system is used in Germany and Spain. Another way of appointing a head of the government, that is Prime Minister, is that where the Parliament nominates a candidate whom the head of the state is constitutionally obliged to appoint as Prime Minister. Now example is Japan, where the Emperor appoints the Prime Minister on the nomination of the national diet. Also Ireland, where the President of Ireland appoints the nomination of where the President of Ireland appoints the nominated candidate. So the system works in Ireland and Japan. Another method is a public office holder other than the head of the state or the representative nominates a candidate who, if approved by Parliament, is appointed as Prime Minister. The example is the Swedish Instrument of Government 1974. The power of appointment someone or power to appoint someone to form a government has been moved from the monarch to the Speaker of Parliament and the Parliament itself. So the Speaker nominates a candidate who then elected to Prime Minister by the Parliament if an absolute majority of the member of Parliament does not vote against the candidate. That is, they can be elected even if more members of the Parliament vote no than yes. Now this system is used in Sweden. Another method of appointing the head of the government, that is Prime Minister, is direct election by popular vote. Now the example is Israel from 1996 to 2001, where the Prime Minister was elected in general election with no regard to political affiliation and whose procedure has also been described as of a semi-parliamentary system. Now this system is used in Israel presently. Now another feature of the parliamentary system is its ministerial responsibility. The ministers are by law or by binding convention members of the legislature. Sometimes a minister may not be an elected member of a legislature. For example, Ramsay MacDonald and Malcolm both were not the elected members of legislature, but both were the members of cabinet in Britain from November 1935 until early in 1936. Though they were not members of parliament, but the House of Commons is extremely critical of such exceptions, and ministers remain out of parliament only while they are trying to find seats. If they cannot get in and are unwilling to be created peers, they resign their office. In Constitution of India as well, a provision is made in this regard that a minister may not be a house of either member of either house of parliament for a period of 6 consecutive months and still can be a minister. But such a minister ceases to be a minister at the expiration of that period unless he is duly elected. In Britain, no one can speak in either house of parliament unless he belongs to that house. In India, a minister enjoys the privilege of occupying a seat in either house of the legislature, of being heard and of participating in its deliberations, but with the right to vote in the house which he is a member. So a parliamentary or cabinet system works on the well-accepted principle that ministers are responsible to the legislature for all their official acts and they remain in office as long as they retain its confidence. Now this is called ministerial responsibility, and it is their responsibility that gives to the parliamentary system the name of a responsible government as well. Now talking about one of the important link between the government executive and the legislature is that of cabinet. Now cabinet is a wheel within a wheel, and it is the pivot on which the whole political machinery revolves in parliamentary system. So it is the supreme directing authority the magnet of policy, as Barker calls it, which coordinates and controls the whole of executive government and integrates and guides the work of legislature. Now, there is a sharp distinction between a cabinet and a ministry or the council of ministers. The cabinet, whichever the parliamentary system exists and wherever it exists, has an extra constitutional growth and consists of about 20 or less ministers who are most influential and the most important of the council of members of the cabinet. Now, these members, they meet collectively under the chairmanship of Prime Minister generally once a week, deciding upon the policy and in general head up of the government. So, the cabinet, also known as ministers or secretariats, is a group of members usually from the executive branch. Cabinet are typically the body responsible for day-to-day management of the government and response to the sudden events, whereas the legislative and judicial branches, they work in a measured pace in sessions according to lengthy procedures. So, the function of a cabinet varies. In some countries, it's the collegiate decision-making body with a collective responsibility, while in others, it may function either as a purely advisory body or an assisting institution to a decision-making head of state or head of government. In some countries, particularly those that use a parliamentary system, that is United Kingdom, the cabinet collectively decides the government's direction, especially in regard to legislation passed by the parliament. Under the Westminster system, members of the cabinet are the ministers of the crown who are collectively responsible for all government policy. So, all ministers, whether senior or in the cabinet or junior ministers, must publicly support the policy of the government, regardless of any private reservations. Although in theory, all cabinet decisions are taken collectively by the cabinet, in practice, many decisions are delegated to the various subcommittees of the cabinet on their findings and recommendations. Now, as these recommendations have already been agreed upon by those in the cabinet who hold affected ministerial portfolios, the recommendations are usually agreed to by the full cabinet with little further discussion. The cabinet may also provide ideas on or if new laws were established and what they include. So, cabinet deliberations are secret and documents dealt with in cabinet are confidential. Now, most of the documentation associated with cabinet deliberations will only be publicly released a considerable period of time after the particular cabinet is disbanded, depending on the provision of nation's freedom of information legislation. Now, that was the example of the collective responsibility. Now, the Council of Ministers or the ministry includes some 50 or more ministers of different categories. The cabinet ministers, ministers of cabinet rank, deputy ministers or parliamentary secretariat. So, the council of ministers or the ministry has no collective functions. It never meets as a whole and it never deliberates on matter of policy. The duties of a minister, unless he is a cabinet minister, are individual duties relating to the administrative department or department of which he holds the charge or to which he is attached. The cabinet is thus the motive power of all political action. Now, such a system of government is commonly known as the cabinet government because cabinet is the master of the government. So, the Council of Ministers is headed by Prime Minister and he is the captain of the team which plays the game of the politics in accordance with the mandate which the majority party in legislature, of which the Prime Minister is the duly accredited leader, has received at the general elections. The Council of Ministers is the hub of parliamentary pattern of government. It may be made up of either entirely of members of the same political faith or of members of somewhat different affiliations, yet able to agree on a program of immediate action. In any case, ministry is formed by a person who seems to the head of the state best able to form a team in conformity with the existing parliamentary majority. Legally, ministers hold office during the pleasure of the king or queen, but a legal truth in Britain is a political untruth, and the pleasure of king and queen means the pleasure of parliament. The Constitution of India also provides that ministers hold office during the pleasure of the president, but the pleasure of the president vanishes when the Constitution simultaneously prescribes that the Council of Ministers is collectively responsible to the House of People, that is the Lok Sabha. This means the individual and collective responsibility of ministers to the House of People. It also means that whereas the Council of Ministers is collectively responsible to the House of People for its policies, a minister can be removed from office for his individual indiscretion or for acts of omission and commission, and the President exercises his pleasure on the advice of the Prime Minister. Without such advice, he cannot act independently. Ministerial responsibility is the essence of parliamentary government. Responsibility to the legislature means that so long as the policies and official conduct of the ministers command the support of the majority of the members of the legislature, they continue to hold the reign of office and govern the country. But as soon as the majority is reduced into a minority and the ministry loses the confidence of representative house, the House of Commons in Britain, the House of People, Lok Sabha in India, it must resign from office and give the opportunity to the opposition to assume office, or the legislature may be dissolved on the advice of the Prime Minister, a new election held in order to ascertain the opinion of the electorate. Now, with that, I come to the end of today's presentation on Parliament and parliamentary system. Thank you.